the weight of consciousness. There are people who cannot help but think deeply, who cannot experience anything without analyzing it, who cannot accept surface explanations but must dig beneath, must question, must understand the layers beneath the layers. They watch a sunset and wonder about mortality. They have a conversation and analyze its subtext for days. They read a sentence and see connections to philosophy, psychology, history, their own experience. For them, thinking is not an occasional activity but a constant state, not something they do but something they are. This is not simply intelligence, though deep thinkers are often intelligent. It is a particular orientation toward reality, a way of engaging with experience that prioritizes understanding over action, meaning over efficiency, depth over breadth. Deep thinkers are the people who ask why when everyone else is satisfied with what, who cannot move forward until they comprehend the underlying patterns, who experience the world as endlessly complex and fascinating and often overwhelming. They are often misunderstood. Others see them as overthinking, as making simple things complicated, as paralyzed by analysis, as unable to just be without constantly questioning and examining. And sometimes this is true. Deep thinking has costs, creates challenges, can become its own prison when taken to extremes. But it also has gifts, offers perspectives others cannot access, reveals truths that remain hidden to those who engage with reality only on its surface. Understanding the psychology of deep thinkers means understanding both the blessing and the burden of a mind that cannot rest, that finds questions more compelling than answers, that experiences depth not as choice but as necessity, the nature of deep thinking more than intelligence. Deep thinking is not the same as intelligence, though the two are often confused. Intelligence is the capacity to process information quickly, to solve problems efficiently, to learn and adapt with skill. But a person can be highly intelligent without being a deep thinker, can excel at standardized tests and professional tasks, while never questioning fundamental assumptions, never examining the foundations of their beliefs, never asking the uncomfortable questions that have no clear answers. Deep thinking is about orientation rather than capacity, about what captures attention and generates curiosity. Deep thinkers are drawn to complexity, to paradox, to questions that cannot be answered definitively. They are less interested in what is than in why it is, less concerned with how things work than with what they mean, less focused on solving problems than on understanding the nature of problems themselves. The psychologist Carl Jung distinguished between introverted thinking and extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking engages with the external world, with facts and data and practical problems. Introverted thinking turns inward, seeks to understand underlying principles, builds internal frameworks of meaning. Deep thinkers tend toward introverted thinking, building elaborate internal models of reality, constantly refining these models based on new information and experience. This orientation often appears early in life. The child who asks endless questions, who is not satisfied with simple answers, who wants to know not just what happens but why, who thinks about death and meaning and existence while other children play without such concerns. These children are often labeled as sensitive, intense, old souls. They experience the world with a depth that feels both like gift and burden, aware of dimensions others do not see. Deep thinking is also connected to what psychologists call need for cognition, the tendency to engage in and enjoy effortful cognitive activity. While most people minimize cognitive effort when possible, choosing the path of least resistance in thinking, deep thinkers actively seek out complex problems, difficult texts, abstract concepts that require sustained mental effort. They find this effort intrinsically rewarding, not because it serves practical goals, but because understanding itself is satisfying. But deep thinking is not simply intellectual, it is also emotional and existential. Deep thinkers feel the weight of existence, feel the significance of choices, feel the complexity of human nature and relationship. They cannot experience anything superficially because their minds automatically probe beneath surface, automatically seek meaning, automatically connect present experience to larger patterns and deeper questions. The gift and curse, seeing what others miss. Deep thinkers see patterns others miss, connections others do not make, implications others do not consider. They notice the inconsistency between what someone says and what they do, the subtext beneath the conversation, the assumption underlying the argument that no one else is questioning. This capacity for pattern recognition, for seeing beneath surface, for detecting complexity where others see simplicity, is both the deep thinker's greatest gift and their heaviest burden. The gift is insight. Deep thinkers often understand situations more completely, see problems before they become crises, recognize truths that others deny or do not notice. They can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, can understand why different people see the same situation differently, can navigate moral and philosophical complexity without needing simplistic answers. This makes them valuable in contexts that require nuanced understanding, strategic thinking, recognition of long-term consequences. But this same capacity becomes cursed when the deep thinker cannot turn it off, cannot stop seeing complexity even when simplicity would be more useful, cannot accept surface answers even when deeper understanding serves no practical purpose. They see the ambiguity in every decision, the problems in every solution, the questions behind every answer. This can create paralysis, can make simple choices agonizing, can turn straightforward situations into elaborate dilemmas. Deep thinkers also carry the burden of awareness. They are aware of mortality in ways others can forget. They are aware of the suffering in the world, the injustice, the absurdity. They are aware of their own contradictions, their own capacity for self-deception, their own tendency toward the very patterns they criticize in others. This awareness is truthful but heavy, honest but exhausting. Ignorance, as the saying goes, is bliss, and deep thinkers cannot access that bliss because they cannot unknow what they know, cannot unsee what they have seen. The curse also includes loneliness. When you see what others do not see, when your mind operates at a different depth, when your concerns are different from those around you, connection becomes difficult. Others find your thinking depressing, pessimistic, unnecessarily complicated. You find their thinking shallow, avoidant, missing what seems obvious to you. Neither is wrong, but the gap creates distance, creates the sense of being fundamentally alone even in the presence of others, of living in a different reality that you cannot fully share. The inner world, living in abstraction. Deep thinkers live more in their inner world than in the external world. The richest experiences are not sensory but conceptual, not events in physical space but movements of thought, not interactions with people and things but engagements with ideas, patterns, meanings. This is not escape or avoidance, though it can become that. It is simply where their attention naturally goes, where they feel most alive, most themselves, most engaged. The inner world of the deep thinker is populated with abstractions, concepts, theories, philosophical questions, psychological patterns, existential concerns. They think about thinking itself, about consciousness, about the nature of knowledge and truth and meaning. They construct elaborate mental models of how things work, how people function, how society operates, how history unfolds. These models are constantly being refined, tested against experience, adjusted based on new information. This life in abstraction creates certain strengths. Deep thinkers can navigate complexity that others find overwhelming, can hold ambiguity without needing premature closure, can think systemically about problems that require understanding multiple interconnected factors. They are comfortable with uncertainty because they recognize that most important questions do not have definitive answers, that wisdom lies in holding tension rather than resolving it prematurely. But living in abstraction also creates disconnection from immediate experience. The deep thinker at a party is thinking about social dynamics, about authenticity and performance, about existential loneliness, while others are simply enjoying themselves. The deep thinker in a beautiful moment is analyzing why beauty moves us, what this reveals about human nature, what it means that this moment will pass and be forgotten. The thinking becomes a filter that prevents direct experience, that translates everything into abstraction before it can be felt. This is the deep thinker's particular challenge: how to think deeply without losing the capacity for immediacy, how to analyze without destroying spontaneity, how to understand without creating distance from life itself. The unexamined life may not be worth living, as Socrates said, but the over-examined life can become unlived, can become so much analysis and reflection that direct engagement with reality atrophies. Deep thinkers often struggle with what philosophers call the problem of self-consciousness, the way that awareness of self changes the experience of self. They cannot be natural or spontaneous because they are always observing themselves being natural or spontaneous, always aware of themselves being aware, trapped in recursive loops of consciousness, examining consciousness. Solitude and alienation. The price of depth. Deep thinkers often find themselves alone, not by misfortune, but by necessity. The depth at which they operate, the complexity they perceive, the questions they ask, these create distance from those who engage with life more simply, more directly, more superficially. This is not judgment, but reality. The person thinking about mortality and meaning while others discuss weekend plans, the person analyzing power dynamics while others gossip, the person questioning fundamental assumptions while others accept convention. This person will feel out of place, will struggle to find their tribe. Solitude becomes both refuge and prison. It is refuge because only in solitude can the deep thinker fully engage with their inner world without the exhausting effort of translating their thinking for others, of pretending to care about conversations that feel trivial, of hiding the depth that makes others uncomfortable. Alone, they can read, think, write, explore ideas without apologizing for their intensity, without moderating their curiosity, without performing normalcy. But solitude also becomes prison when it extends too long, when chosen refuge becomes enforced isolation, when the deep thinker realizes they have withdrawn so completely into their inner world that they have lost connection with the external world, with people, with the messiness of actual human relationship. The philosopher's tower, the writer's study, the thinker's solitary walk, these can become not just temporary retreats, but permanent exile. The alienation deep thinkers experience is existential more than social. Even when surrounded by people, even in intimate relationships, they often feel fundamentally alone because their experience of reality differs from those around them. They see complexity where others see simplicity, feel weight where others feel lightness, ask questions where others find answers sufficient. This creates a particular kind of loneliness, the loneliness of consciousness that cannot be shared, of depth that cannot be communicated, of seeing what others cannot see. Kierkegaard wrote about the crowd being untruth, about how mass society demands conformity and punishes those who think independently, who question deeply, who refuse to accept comfortable lies. The deep thinker experiences this pressure constantly, the subtle and not so subtle messages that they should think less, should accept more, should stop making things so complicated, should just be normal. And the tragedy is that they cannot, that their depth is not choice but nature, not performance but authentic orientation toward reality. The paralysis of analysis, overthinking, and action. The deep thinker's greatest weakness is often their inability to act. They see too much, understand too many angles, recognize too many implications. Where others make decisions quickly based on limited information, the deep thinker continues analyzing, continues considering alternatives, continues questioning whether they have understood sufficiently, whether their reasoning is sound, whether unforeseen consequences await. This paralysis of analysis is not cowardice, but the burden of consciousness. Not indecision, but the recognition that every choice forecloses other possibilities, that action requires accepting uncertainty, that the deep thinker finds difficult to tolerate. The overthinker lies awake, replaying conversations, analyzing what was said and not said, what was meant beneath the words, what they should have responded, what the exchange reveals about the relationship and about themselves. A simple interaction becomes hours of analysis, yields insights but also exhaustion, understanding but also disconnection from the immediacy of living. They cannot simply have a conversation and move on. They must process it, must understand it, must extract meaning from it. This overthinking extends to decisions both large and small. What career to pursue becomes not just a practical question but an existential one about identity, values, meaning, legacy. What to say in a difficult conversation becomes elaborate rehearsal of possibilities, consideration of how each phrase might be interpreted, analysis of underlying motives, and likely responses. The mental energy expended in this analysis leaves little energy for actual action, for the living that happens between the thinking. Nietzsche warned about this danger, about those who think so much that they cannot act, who analyze so deeply that they become paralyzed, who question so thoroughly that they lose the capacity for the decisive action that life sometimes requires. He valued what he called Dionysian energy, the capacity for spontaneity, for instinct, for saying yes to life without needing to fully understand it first. The deep thinker, overly Apollonian in Nietzsche's terms, becomes trapped in consciousness, becomes unable to access the vital energies that drive action. The challenge for deep thinkers is learning when to stop thinking and start acting, when to accept that perfect understanding is impossible and sufficient understanding must be enough, when to trust intuition over analysis, when to leap without knowing exactly where they will land. This is not about becoming less thoughtful, but about recognizing that thinking without action is incomplete, that understanding that never manifests in living is sterile, that depth must eventually express itself through engagement with reality rather than perpetual retreat into contemplation, integration, using depth without being consumed. The question for deep thinkers is not whether to think deeply, which is not really a choice, but how to integrate depth with living, how to use the gift without being consumed by it, how to think profoundly while also acting effectively, feeling genuinely, connecting authentically. This integration requires developing capacities that do not come naturally to those who live primarily in their minds. The first capacity is learning to think in time-bound ways, to set limits on analysis, to practice what might be called strategic shallowness. Not every conversation needs hours of processing. Not every decision requires exhaustive consideration of alternatives. Not every experience must be analyzed for meaning. The deep thinker must learn to sometimes engage with life on its surface, to participate without constantly examining the participation, to allow some experiences to pass without extracting lessons from them. This does not mean abandoning depth, but choosing when depth serves and when it hinders. Some questions deserve extended contemplation. Others require quick decisions based on incomplete information. Some experiences are enriched by reflection. Others are diminished by it, need to be lived immediately, felt directly, allowed to be what they are, without interpretation. The wisdom is knowing the difference, knowing when to think and when to simply be. The second capacity is embodiment, learning to inhabit the body and not just the mind, to recognize that thinking is not the only form of knowing, that the body carries intelligence that conceptual analysis cannot access. Physical activity, whether exercise or dance or simply walking, can quiet the overactive mind, can provide relief from constant mental activity, can reconnect the deep thinker to immediate sensory experience rather than abstract reflection. Meditation and mindfulness practices can help deep thinkers develop what Buddhists call bare attention, the capacity to observe without immediately analyzing, to be aware without generating commentary, to experience thoughts as events in consciousness rather than as truth that must be pursued or problems that must be solved. This does not eliminate thinking but creates space around it, prevents identification with every thought, allows some distance from the constant mental chatter. Connection with others provides essential balance. Deep thinkers need people who can meet them at their depth, who find their questions interesting rather than exhausting, who share their orientation toward meaning and understanding. But they also need people who can pull them out of their heads, who invite them to play, to laugh, to engage with life's lighter aspects, who remind them that not everything must be heavy or profound or meaningful. Creative expression offers outlet for depth that does not require others to understand or validate. Writing, art, music, these allow the deep thinker to express the complexity they perceive, to give form to abstract insights, to communicate depth without needing to translate it into conventional conversation. Creation becomes the bridge between inner and outer world, between abstraction and manifestation. The deep thinker must also make peace with their nature, must accept that they will always see more complexity than others, will always ask more questions, will always feel the weight of consciousness more heavily. This is not defect, but difference, not problem, but personality, not something to fix, but something to integrate and use wisely. The goal is not to become shallow, but to avoid drowning in depth, not to stop thinking, but to prevent thinking from becoming the only thing. The psychology of deep thinkers reveals both the blessing and burden of a mind oriented toward depth, complexity, meaning. These are the people who cannot accept surface explanations, who must probe beneath, who experience reality as endlessly layered and fascinating and often overwhelming. They are not simply intelligent, but oriented differently, drawn to questions rather than answers, to understanding rather than efficiency, to meaning rather than distraction. This orientation brings genuine gifts. Deep thinkers see patterns others miss, understand complexity others cannot navigate, ask questions that reveal truths others avoid or do not notice. They can hold ambiguity, can think systemically, can navigate philosophical and psychological terrain that appears impenetrable to those who engage with reality more superficially. Their insights, when expressed, can transform how others see themselves and the world. But depth also carries costs. The constant analysis that prevents spontaneity, the awareness that becomes burden, the complexity that creates paralysis, the alienation from those who do not share this orientation. Deep thinkers often find themselves alone, not by choice but by the inevitable distance that emerges when consciousness operates at different depths, when one person's trivial is another's profound, when questions that keep one person awake at night never occur to another. The challenge is integration, learning to use depth without being consumed by it, to think profoundly while also living fully, to maintain the capacity for analysis without losing the capacity for immediacy. This requires developing what does not come naturally, the ability to engage with surface when surface is sufficient, to act despite uncertainty, to connect with others across differences in cognitive depth, to sometimes stop thinking and simply be. Deep thinkers are not better than others, despite what their ego might suggest in moments of alienation and judgment. They are different, oriented differently, experiencing reality through a particular lens that reveals certain truths while obscuring others. The person who thinks deeply about everything may miss what the person engaged directly with living experiences without reflection. Both perspectives are valid, both incomplete, both necessary for full human flourishing. For deep thinkers themselves, the work is accepting their nature while not being imprisoned by it, honoring their need for depth while also developing capacity for lightness, using their gift for insight while also learning to simply live without constant analysis. This balance is difficult but essential, requires ongoing practice, requires accepting that perfection is impossible and good enough must be sufficient. For those who love deep thinkers, understanding helps. Their silences are not rejection but processing. Their questions are not criticism but curiosity. Their intensity is not performance but authentic orientation toward reality. They need space for solitude but also invitation to connection. Appreciation for their insights but also reminder that not everything must be profound. The deep thinker's journey is learning to live with a mind that never fully rests, that finds questions more compelling than answers, that sees complexity in everything. This is not easy, will never be easy, but it can be meaningful, can be rich, can be the foundation for a life lived with awareness and authenticity, even if not with ease. The world needs deep thinkers, needs those who ask uncomfortable questions, who refuse simple answers, who probe beneath surface to reveal patterns and possibilities others cannot see. But deep thinkers also need the world, need engagement with reality beyond their own consciousness, need relationships that pull them out of isolation, need action that manifests their insights, rather than letting them remain only abstractions. Thinking deeply is not the problem. Being only thought, living only in abstraction, analyzing without acting, seeing without engaging, understanding without connecting, this is the danger. The integrated deep thinker thinks profoundly and lives fully, questions deeply and acts decisively, sees complexity and tolerates simplicity, inhabits both the inner world of ideas and the outer world of relationship and action. This integration is the work of a lifetime, never complete, always in process. But it is work worth doing, for the deep thinker's sake, and for the sake of a world that needs both depth and action, both understanding and engagement, both contemplation and living. If you recognize yourself in this exploration of deep thinking, if you have felt both the blessing and burden of a mind that cannot help but probe beneath surface, then you are not alone. The alienation deep thinkers feel is real, but so is the community of others who share this orientation, who understand what it means to live with constant questions, with seeing complexity, with feeling the weight of consciousness. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that honors intellectual and philosophical depth, that explores the psychology of how different minds operate, that validates experiences that mainstream culture often dismisses as overthinking. Share this with someone who thinks deeply, who needs to know their nature is not defect but difference, not problem but perspective. Leave a comment sharing your experience as a deep thinker or your experience knowing and loving deep thinkers. What challenges have you faced? What gifts has this orientation brought? How have you learned to balance depth with living? This community exists for those who think deeply about thinking itself, who find these questions compelling rather than exhausting. Remember, if you are a deep thinker, your nature is not something to fix. The goal is not to become shallow, but to learn to use depth wisely, to think profoundly without being paralyzed, to see complexity without being overwhelmed, to integrate insight with action. Your questions matter, your insights have value. Your depth, when integrated with living, is gift not just to you but to a world that desperately needs those who refuse simple answers to complex questions. Practice strategic shallowness when depth does not serve. Cultivate embodiment to balance mental activity. Seek connection with those who can meet you at your depth. Express your insights creatively. Act despite uncertainty. Live as well as think. And know that the tension between depth and action, between contemplation and engagement, between understanding and living, this tension is not problem but the creative force that, when held consciously, produces the richest human experience. You are not overthinking, you are thinking deeply. The challenge is learning when depth serves and when it hinders, when to analyze and when to leap, when to question and when to trust. This discernment comes not from thinking more but from living more, from testing your insights against reality, from discovering through experience what your analysis alone cannot reveal. The world needs deep thinkers, but deep thinkers also need the world. Step out of your head sometimes. Engage with immediacy. Connect with others. Act on your insights. Let your depth express itself through living, not just through endless contemplation. This is how thinking becomes wisdom, how insight becomes contribution, how the deep thinker's gift serves not just their own understanding, but the world's transformation.